foster care, trauma, and tips and tricks. So now let's jump into 10 tips and tricks that we have found helpful to help kids that have come into our homes with trauma. The first thing that we've experienced that really helps kids that come into our care with trauma is to really let these children lead the way. We don't know their story. We don't know what are triggering events in their lives. We don't know what their needs are, because oftentimes what we've experienced are a lot of these kids really don't know how to articulate what it is they're thinking, what they're feeling. Maybe they even disassociate from their emotions so that you can't clearly see what their needs are, but they will tell you with their behaviors. So look and listen and wait and hear what those behaviors are saying. We had one child in our home that came into our home and she was severely traumatized to where she would cry and rage and rage. As a mom, especially as a foster mom, my first instinct was to hug that little girl and to hold her. She was tiny, and I know that she didn't understand what she was feeling. But at the moment of that traumatic response, she wasn't thinking, she wasn't rationalizing. She was just trying to emotionally keep herself safe. And so as I went over to try to hug her and try to hold her in my arms, she would rage further. And what she needed, what we realized, was just some space. She was telling me with her behaviors, don't touch me, don't look at me, don't give me any more stimulation in my environment, music or talking to or trying to communicate what's going on or how are you feeling. She just needed some space. And months later, we saw that same thing, that this child, in order to kind of regroup, she just needed a little bit of space, not up in a bedroom or away from everybody else, but just maybe quietly in the next room where she could see us, so she could calm herself down and kind of get back in center and be able to move forward with the rest of her day. Let the kids lead the way. The second thing that we found helpful for kids that have experienced trauma is to be able to look at these kids, not at their typical age, but at their emotional age. So we may have a child who's 5, but really missed out on the first really defining years of that infancy of that child. Maybe they didn't nurse, maybe they were never held, or maybe they were never fed on time. And so these children can miss gaps and big sections in their lives. And so as we look at children according to their emotional age, you may need to rock a 3 or 4-year-old as if they were an infant, or you may need to play games and, role play with toys to be able to learn about that child so you can hear what they're saying, because they're not old enough emotionally to communicate their needs with you. As we look at kids according to their emotional age, we tend to have more patience. So if we look at a 10-year-old and we expect them to act like a 10-year-old, they may disappoint and they may make us frustrated because they are not doing what every other child at 10-year-old is doing. But if you look at that child and understand that they've had 5 years of trauma and they are typically emotionally a 5-year-old, we'll have a lot more grace and a lot more patience to be able to meet that child where they're at. The third practical way that we've been able to help kids that have been in our care is to look for triggers, to be able to see and observe what are the things that make our kids upset, or to have rages or outrages or emotional reactions that seem exaggerated. So we may have a child in our care that right around lunchtime, if they are 5 minutes late eating lunch, their body kind of knows, and they will start to feel like maybe they didn't eat on time, or they didn't eat full, complete meals, or they didn't eat for days before coming into our care. And so when it gets to be lunchtime, and if they haven't had a meal, that can be a trigger. They can have an emotional meltdown or a rage, or they may over and over say, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry. And so their body is responding. Their body has kept score of past trauma, and they are letting you know what their triggers possibly could be if their needs are not met in the same exact way that they need them to be met. We've had other kids that they insist on do not shut the door to their bedroom. It's terrifying, or they can't sleep in the dark, or maybe they're afraid of a certain animal or a certain loud noise that can make them cry. We have a lot of kids actually that are scared of the dark, or if there's lightning. And so there's all these things that can be triggers. For me, I know when I'm in the middle of parenting, I don't really think like, oh, that's a trigger. Maybe I should be aware of that so next time this happens, I can respond differently. And so maybe a good way for you, and it's been helpful for me, is to sit down and write down, okay, they had an exaggerated emotional response. What was that? What was the message behind that? What were they trying to say? Maybe they couldn't find their coat when they were going to school, and so they had a meltdown. But maybe that was connected to something in their past where they didn't have a coat, or they were cold, or they didn't have a blanket. And so there's a connection there. And so I encourage you to write down those emotional responses. And my guess is you're going to see a pattern to be able to identify triggers, to be able to help that child better in the future. The fourth thing that we have found that helps kids that have experienced trauma is to look for allergies or food sensitivities. This is huge. I know it's really overlooked, especially in foster care often, because we're just trying to get food on the table and, them to bed on time and baths and all the things that they need. However, if there is an underlying allergy, it may come out like an emotional response. It may come out like trauma, or it may exaggerate present trauma that's already there. We had one child in our home, and he was one of the hardest cases in our area. Everywhere we went, people knew his name, and we had this little guy for a year. And what we experienced over time was when he would have dairy, he would have emotional rages and fits and outbursts. And over time, we started to kind of pinpoint, and we realized that it's the casein, I believe, if I'm saying that right, within the milk that he was actually allergic to. So there were some things he could have and some things he couldn't have. And as we began to cut out gluten and casein and milk and dairy, he began to thrive in our home. He was calmer. His disposition was calmer. He began to learn and to give and to receive affection. And it was a radical change. And this was because we were alerted to food sensitivities, red dyes, and things that may trigger him with traumatic responses. The fifth way that we practically have been able to help kids with trauma in our home, and really I don't want to take credit for this because it's really my husband is who kind of discovered this, is that when kids are starting to lose it or become emotional or rage or get angry, they start to really deregulate. What he found is simply take them by the hand or pick them up if they're small and take them outside. Change their environment. They will hear birds. They will have a lot of visual stimulation. They will feel calmed by nature. And maybe you're not able to go outside. Maybe turn on music, or maybe open a book. Maybe change the story in the narrative in their head to something logical. Ask a question that makes them think and have to shift from that right part of the brain that's emotional to that left part of the brain. It has worked wonders, and I've seen my husband do this time and time again, and it is a powerful, powerful tool to help kids that have experienced trauma. The sixth practical way that you can help kids that have gone through trauma is really for you to get some space. This is huge as well, because when we're dysregulated, when we're emotional and highly charged, when we're triggered, we can't parent well. We can't be calm. We can't be collected. We can't be logical. We can't handle a situation without emotions, with consistency and love and patience like we need to. There are times when we've had kids that have had severe trauma in our home, and sometimes I just say, I need to go upstairs and give myself a time out. I need to step away from that situation and really regroup, really centralize myself so that I can come back and be an effective parent. For you, maybe that means you need to go for a walk. Maybe you need to listen to music or a podcast. Maybe you need to even go somewhere with a friend for a moment and vent and be able to discuss what's going on in your home. But to step away and get space really does help us as we parent kids with trauma. The seventh way that may be a practical tip for you to be able to help kids with trauma that are in your home is to not engage emotionally with a child. There are children that may be antagonistic, that may want to provoke, that may want to get in a battle or a screaming match or an emotionally driven, escalated situation. However, we as adults, we can handle things logically. We can see things from a practical way to where we can parent and be the ones in charge. It doesn't mean that we're not sympathetic. It doesn't mean that we don't care or that we're not loving, but we can practically make sure that we are the safe person for that child as they show accelerated emotions and as they need someone to be grounded in a certain situation. If we do choose to engage in emotional reactions with these kids, I guarantee we've already lost. We will not win. These children will feel like there is no safe place. They will feel like their emotions dictated the situation, which will be a predictor of future situations. And my guess is we will also start to experience secondary trauma. So their trauma and what they're behaving like in our house, it may come and kind of transfer to us, where we maybe need to go to therapy or maybe need more time away or maybe need to regroup. And so I encourage you, one of the biggest things that we can do as we parent kids with trauma is to not emotionally engage with these kids in a screaming battle or a fight or a fit, to be connected and rooted and grounded in logic, but also a lot of love. The 8th thing that we can do as we parent kids with trauma is really called the 3 C's. It is to be calm and collected and consistent. We've kind of discussed being calm, being logical, being really rooted in who we are before we go to engage with a child that is having a traumatic experience. But also be collected. Gather your thoughts, gather your emotions, gather what you might say to that child, or really reframe how you're going to handle a situation when it presents itself to you. What will you do? How will you respond? What are the consequences to that situation? And lastly, it is to be consistent, to respond the same way every single time. I've seen really excellent parents who love their kids so much. However, a lot of times, based on their energy or maybe even the support that's in their community, they will respond different. One time they will rage and act wild and unruly, and the next time they will have harsh maybe punishments for that child. And so that child doesn't know. It's not a consistent home. They don't know what kind of parent they're going to get that day. So the biggest advice is really to stay calm, connected, collected, as well as consistent as you parent these kids. The 9th way that we have practically helped kids with trauma in our home is we have done a lot of talking and a lot of listening. We have made sure to really not be the therapist. We want to be more like a coach, to where we're not giving advice or we're not trying to fix our children. We need our kids to seek inside themselves and to be able to make logical decisions about how they can help themselves better. That often includes a lot of questions, a lot of listening, even hours and hours of listening to these kids, hearing their heart, hearing about their past experiences. From my experience, we have taken kids to therapy for an hour once or twice a week, over and over, for years and years. However, there's nothing safer than a foster parent or an adopted parent who loves that child, who's choosing to really spend themselves on behalf of that child, that child can feel so safe and so loved that they're willing to share things that they wouldn't with a therapist. So I encourage you, sit down, spend time, ask questions, and really listen to your child who's experienced trauma. The 10th practical way that you can help kids with trauma is to pray. And I know I say this in so many of my videos, but it is vital. If we are foster parents, if we are adopted parents, there's only so much we could do. We could be perfect. We could have read every book. We could have gone to all the training that there is. But oftentimes I've known in my own life, there are things that are spiritual that I can't even fix myself, that there is only someone bigger than me that can help me to get through a situation. So how much more a child that's experienced trauma? How much more do they need someone bigger and outside of themselves to be able to move forward and get past the hurdles in their life? I love this one because prayer isn't something we have to do loud and bold and announce it. And we can just quietly kneel in our bedrooms and we can pray. We can talk to God. We can ask him to help these children that are in our home. And most of all, to help us to be able to have strategies and insight and wisdom in how to parent them well. Because kids who come from traumatic responses, there is freedom, but it comes through someone bigger than them. And it is really a gift from God that any of us change from who we were to who we want to be. And these are my final thoughts. If you're watching this today and you have a child that has experienced a lot of trauma, if you're struggling with their behaviors, if you are feeling kind of lost or you're kind of feeling alone, I just want you to know that I see you, first of all. I get you. I've been there. I've experienced it. It can feel lonely. It can feel isolating. It can feel like you just can't go on. You can feel maybe like you've fallen in a deep well and you can't even get out, or that you're spinning and spitting like in a cyclone and there's really no escape. But I want to encourage you today that there is a solution, there is a hope, and it doesn't often come with great leaps and bounds. Often what we've experienced, the change in the kids that have had trauma in our home, are little tiny increments of steps. And sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 1 back, or 1 step forward and 2 back. But eventually, our kids will know that we love them and that we have not given up on them. So again, I see you and I hear you and I have been there. And finally, I just wanted to share stories of 3 of the kids that we've experienced that have come with trauma in our home. The first one is a child, and I won't say the gender. I'll try to keep it as discreet and private as I can. This child was known to have extreme behaviors, fights and rages and fits and destruction. And I had heard the stories about this child, but I had prayed and I knew that God wanted me to take this child. I'm not going to lie, I was a little terrified. It was out of my element, out of my scope of what I had learned or even known. And for whatever reason, this child came into our home and there was not one day that this child raged or yelled or hit or fought. This child was incredible. It was completely different than on paper who they had said this child would be. It was a beautiful thing. And as I tell you that, I want you to know that you may see a child again with behaviors and you may question whether you are to take that child, but we don't know what a perfect home for that particular child may be. And so while one child may behave a certain way and in a certain environment, they may behave completely different in your home. So don't be afraid or scared of kids with trauma. You may never know that your home is the exact home that child may need. The second child was also a child that had significant trauma, completely unrelated to the first child. This child took a lot of work, a lot of therapy, years of really investing in this child. It was a slow progress, lots of therapy, lots of doctors and appointments, and we spent ourselves on this child. Surprisingly and incredibly, this child transformed over time. Again, it wasn't big leaps and bounds. It wasn't a sudden change like the previous child where it was one way, a certain way, and then in our home, a different way. But it was little by little, we began to see this change, and we saw the difference that love and consistency can make. And then the last child that I want to share with you was a child who also has significant trauma, significant issues, and it was extremely hard. It was almost unbearable at the beginning, super hard. We did, again, everything that we possibly could do. We learned everything we could, really put into practice all the skill sets that we had, all the tools that we had available to us to be able to help this child. We worked and invested and loved, and we loved this child as if it was our very own child. And what we found after a year was that we were no longer to parent this child, that although this child did progress and get better, that there were some underlying things that we were just not able to help. And it ended up that this child needed to go to a different home, and it really rocked us. It really shook us. And maybe you're in a place like that where you think, is this a bad fit? Is this not the child that we're meant to have? And although it was a year that, in retrospect, it was one of the hardest years in my entire life, I will not regret that year that we invested in this particular child, because we adored this child. And I just pray that over time that this child will know that they were loved and adored, and they were a valuable part, and they still are, of our hearts. So in saying all that, there are different scenarios. There's children that will radically and immediately change when they come into your home. There's children that over time they will get better. And there's some children that may have underlying things that you cannot just help with 1, 2, 3 and just a trip to the doctor and everything is better. And so I encourage you to evaluate your situation and to have hope, because like researchers say, that over time with consistency and love, trauma can get better. If you need more resources, again, look below. We'll try to do more videos on trauma. However, just know again that you are seen and you are cared about and you are not alone. And go out, live bold, and be brave. And again, we'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching.